I would like to introduce George Bongard, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Vermont. There, Professor Bongard runs the Morphology, Evolution, and Cognition Laboratory. The interesting problem that Professor Bongard wants to solve, together with his team and collaborators, is creating robots that are autonomous and can cope with changes in the environment. In his career, already early on, Professor Bongard has been the recipient of several prestigious awards, including the Microsoft Research Faculty Fellowship and also the award from the US government given to outstanding scientists and engineers. But the indication of excellence is shown not only by the awards received, but also by the ability to strike up fruitful collaborations. And one such collaboration has been with a team working at Tufts University. Professor Bongard will talk about this line of work today and what you can get when you combine computer science knowledge and biology knowledge. One thing that you can get is Xenobots.
I'm going to be speaking today about Xenobots, which is the result of a collaboration with Michael Levin, a biology professor at Tufts. And so I've sort of somewhat humorously titled my talk here, a talk about AI in two parts. So my part will be part one. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my view of the history of artificial intelligence and how, at least in my case, in my lab, it led up to the creation of the Xenobots. So I'm going to try and connect Xenobots with artificial intelligence. And then the second part will be given by Mike Levin next month, and he will give, I think, much more of the biological underpinnings of the Xenobot work and others. So before I talk about the Xenobots, however, I want to talk about two other creatures, red herrings and iguanas. And so let's start with red herrings. So for the non-native English speakers out there, a red herring is a phrase in English which means something that is intended intentionally to be misleading or distracting. What is it in artificial intelligence over the past decades that's been somewhat distracting? I would argue one thing is that this equals this. This is a trend we can see in artificial intelligence going all the way back to the Second World War over 70 years ago when the first computers were being built. And there was the first thinking about whether we could actually create intelligent machines. Since the 1940s, the study of intelligent machines has broken into two parts. There is AI, which primarily focuses on or is focused on, and you might argue, somewhat obsessed with the brain. And the other half is focused on robotics and trying to create smart machines that somehow use their body to support adaptive or intelligent behavior. I can see my chat window, so I'll just pause for a moment. I'm happy to give my lecture and then take questions after the fact. If, however, there is a burning question about something specific on a slide or something I've said and it shows up in chat, I'm happy to answer questions as I go along as well. So I don't know if the brain was made intentionally misleading or distracting by the early practitioners of AI, but it definitely is a magnet, something that tends to draw attention when we try and think about what intelligence is. And it can be so much of a magnet that it often draws our attention away from some of the other aspects of smart machines or smart organisms that support intelligent behavior, which is the body. You can see this, this intense focus on the brain in AI and these days in modern machine learning by looking for gaps in the literature. So if you go to Google Scholar and you type in, for example, Hebbian Learning and machine learning, you get back a very large number of results. For those that aren't familiar with Hebbian learning, this is the idea that if you have one neuron connected to another neuron and they both spike at about the same time, the strength of the synaptic connection between them will strengthen. If they activate at different points in time, the connection between them will atrophy or weaken. In English, Hebbian learning is often referred to as neurons that fire together, wire together. It's a very old idea in neuroscience and has bled into machine learning research. It has been studied to great depth in the field. Let me introduce you to another dynamic at work in your own body. This is known as Wolff's Law, and this has to do with bone development and maintenance. Mammalian bone is able to sense mechanical load that acts on the bone. And Wolff's Law is a law that exists in bone development, which is that bone will strengthen exactly where it feels increased mechanical loading. So it's a very similar principle to Hebbian learning. There is a signal that directs attention to where exactly adaptation should occur. And you can think of Wolff's Law as sort of the morphological equivalent of Hebbian learning. It's a very adaptive process. It's at work, especially in young children as they're growing. As we know, human infants are not able to walk. It's not just that they are not able to walk or that they don't know how to walk. Their bodies are not strong enough to actually support their weight on their legs. When an infant starts to grasp onto mom or dad's legs and starts to pull themselves up, as they do so, that directs mechanical load to exactly the places in the growing infant's ankle and shins about where the bone should strengthen to allow them to support their own weight. So in trying to walk, that provides the appropriate signals to the body to learn how to walk. Wolff's Law, you think, would be very useful in robotics as well. One of the major focus in robotics is trying to teach robots to walk. But if you do a similar Google Scholar search, you'll see that there are very, very few papers about this. I think 338 is actually an overestimate. I would imagine there's actually about a dozen papers that really try and take this idea and build it into machines, compared to taking Hebbian learning and trying to build that into neural networks. So you can see this real focus on the neural support of intelligent behavior, not so much on the morphological support of intelligent behavior. Okay, as just another example, this was an article published in the MIT Technology Review magazine just 2 days ago, reporting a very exciting piece of research that was demonstrating how intelligence and body plans are closely linked. So for a lot of people, this seemed to be a recent revelation that body and brain are connected to produce adaptive behavior. But of course, this has been an idea that's been around for quite a long time, but not so much in the mainstream of AI research. Going back a few years, my PhD advisor, Rolf Pfeiffer, and I published a book exactly about this, about how the body is a very important part of intelligent behavior. And if we want to try and make artificial intelligence, or even AGI, artificial general intelligence, we argue that the body is going to have to be in a very important part of that process. Put very succinctly, we and robots can use their bodies to push against the world, perform actions, and observe how the world pushes back. And that feedback loop that starts with action and ends with sensory repercussion, that provides the appropriate training data on which to build up intelligent behavior. It is a very unorthodox view. It is a minority view in the larger AI community. And I'm here to try and sell this idea and use the Xenobots as an example of what happens when you focus on the body as well as the brain. Okay. So one red herring, I would argue, is neurons and synapses in neuroscience and AI. In biology, one could argue that there is another red herring. There is another mechanism that is somewhat distracting, which is DNA. There is a it seems obvious that in biology, DNA encodes the animal. So there is some obviously very complicated process that turns DNA into a stable adult phenotype. We have herring DNA that results in herring. We have frog DNA that results in frogs. It seems so obvious, it doesn't even seem up for discussion. In biology, like in neuroscience, there's a lot of emphasis on genetics and trying to engineer new kinds of organisms by genetically engineering their DNA. I'll pause for a moment. There's a question. Why is simulation not enough to replace reality feedback? That's a really good question. So I was just talking about the brain and the body, and we can also talk about simulation versus reality. For the moment, I'm going to assume that embodiment, meaning having a body, does not necessarily imply that you need to have a physical body. As long as you have a body that you can use to push against the world, that world could be the physical world, or that world could be a virtual world. As long as the world, in whatever sense it is it pushes back, gives you a result of your action, if you're able to influence that environment and observe the result of that action, you are an embodied agent. You may be a virtually embodied agent, or you may be a physically embodied agent. But if you're not embodied at all, if you are not able to push against your world and observe how the world pushes back, I would argue that you're at a disadvantage compared to embodied agents. Great question. Okay. So again, we have these two red herrings for the moment. We have neurons and synapses in neuroscience and genetics in biology. What happens, neurons in neuroscience and genetics in biology? What else is there? How do we pull back and take a more holistic view of the organism or the machine to understand its intelligence in the former case, or build intelligence into intelligent machines in the latter case? So let's move on for a moment. Let's move on from red herrings to iguanas. Why iguanas? Well, I'm going to go a little bit further back in time. In the late 1970s, the Canadian philosopher Xenon Plissien published an article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, where he argued, and he wasn't the only one, he argued that we were not going to be able to achieve artificial intelligence if we just keep putting together the building blocks of intelligence. If we just cobble together language abilities, sensory abilities, visual abilities, memory, motivation, and reasoning. In other words, if we take each chapter in a typical psychology textbook and build that into a machine and try and put those together, we'll get an intelligent machine. Professor Plissien felt that wasn't the right way to go. We need to take a holistic view. We need to bring a large base of knowledge, in his case, that was psychological knowledge, to bear in a disciplined way in all cognitive tasks. In the BBS journal, you publish your paper, and then the journal will invite a large number of experts to write very short responses to your article. So in response to this particular article by Plissien, Daniel Dennett, a very prominent philosopher, wrote a response where in essence he agreed with Plissien, but asked if that's true, if we should be trying to model whole cognitive creatures, why aren't we doing that? Even back in the 1970s, people were already at work on what today would be known as natural language processing, computer vision, causal reasoning. The AI community, even back then, was already fractured into these different groups working on different parts of cognition. Plissien and Dennett were trying to bring everyone back together and work on trying to understand or create whole cognitive creatures. Dennett asked why we weren't doing this, and one obvious answer is because it's very difficult to model the complete cognitive agent that is a human being. We are just too complex. So Dennett asked, why don't we simply scale down and try and study a much simpler animal like a starfish, or in his case, he mentioned a starfish or a turtle or some other animal. Dennett went on to argue that we might not do that because people simply aren't that interested in starfishes or turtles, or we're not really trying to create artificially intelligent turtles. We might get too wrapped up in the details of any one existing organism. So somewhat playfully, Professor Dennett argued, why don't we make up a creature, something that doesn't yet exist? Something that seems very far from any existing organism, but is still a cognitive whole. It is still capable of language, vision, reasoning, and so on. And again, so playfully, he threw out this idea of a three-wheeled iguana from Mars. As far as we know, there aren't any three-wheeled iguanas on Mars. But this somewhat playful question became known in the 80s and into the 90s as, why not the whole iguana? And that phrase, why not the whole iguana, was the philosophers and the cognitive scientists and even the neuroscientists back then arguing that we can't allow AI to continue to fracture and focus on these things. We have to pull the field back together and focus on creating or understanding an entire cognitive agent. Very difficult thing to do. And again, there was that call from the 80s into the 90s and even into the early 2000s. And then the deep learning revolution hit us, and they focus on neural networks and getting neural networks to produce or understand language, getting neural networks to see patterns in data, getting neural networks to do causal reasoning became even more of a focus for most people in the AI and machine learning community. So in some ways, the deep learning revolution took us even further away from what Professor Dennett would call the whole iguana. So until we get the field back to studying iguanas, or until we find a three-wheeled iguana on Mars, Professor Levin and myself would like to offer up this exotic creature as a very simple creature, but is able to exhibit some, not all, of the cognitive abilities we would like to see in an artificially generally intelligent machine. And this is the Xenobot. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the Xenobots and where we hope to go with this technology in the not too distant future. So the Xenobot is a frog and not a frog. The Xenobot that you see in top left, that's about 1 millimeter in diameter. So if you were to see a Xenobot moving around in a petri dish, it would look like a moving grain of sand. It is built completely from frog tissue, and it's tissue taken from the African clawed frog, Xenopus laevis, which led to our little creature up here being nicknamed the Xenobot. We reported the first instance of Xenobots a little over a year ago. And I'm going to walk you through sort of this methodology. The first thing we did was to model little bits of frog tissue. We focused initially on 2 parts of the frog, skin cells, which are going to be represented in a moment in a simulation as a small patch of cubical tissue shown in light blue here. And we also modeled cardiac tissue, heart muscle tissue. If you extract heart muscle tissue from very early frog embryo, that piece of tissue will increase and decrease in volume. And if you put that tissue together in the shape of an adult frog heart, that tissue will synchronize and beat in and out in synchrony, and which is what you want, because you want the heart to act like a pump. You want it to decrease and increase in volume. So we're going to model these 2 pieces of tissue. This one is going to be, this little cube here is going to be soft and deformable, like frog skin cells are. And this little voxel here, this little small cubical patch of tissue, we're going to assume that it increases and decreases in volume. We're going to take these 2 model building blocks, and we're going to turn them over to an AI method. And we're going to ask that AI method to treat these as Lego bricks, little pieces that can be put together in arbitrary configurations. And what we want the AI method to do is search the space of all possible Lego sculptures, all possible ways of combining and recombining this tissue, and looking for particular combinations of these tissue models that produce something that's about 1 millimeter in diameter and moves forward as quickly as possible. So we're asking for a behavior, which is rapid motion. And the AI is going to have to solve what's known as the inverse problem. It's going to have to find the physical structure, the tissue rearrangement in this case, that produces the desired behavior. The AI method that we used is a very simple evolutionary algorithm or a genetic algorithm. Again, this is an idea that goes back to the 1970s. For the non-computer scientists in the room, it's not that difficult an idea. In the case of an evolutionary algorithm, what you do is you tell it what the building blocks are. As I mentioned, we have our simulated skin in blue and our simulated heart muscle tissue in red and green here. The genetic algorithm will make a population of randomly combined tissue. And what you're looking at on the left here, these are 3 of the 100 random arrangements that the genetic algorithm made at the beginning. And you'll notice, not surprisingly, that among these 100 random designs, or among the 3 random designs that you see here, they do very poorly at the desired behavior, which is to move quickly away from the point of origin. If you look very carefully, you'll notice that the one in the bottom left moves a little bit further away from the origin than the other 2 do. Not surprisingly, the one in the upper left with very little muscle tissue barely moves at all. The genetic algorithm will delete the simulated xenobots in the population that are moving slowly, and it will make randomly modified copies of the remaining faster moving simulated xenobots to fill those emptied slots. You have another 100 xenobots. The evolutionary algorithm evaluates the speed of all of them, again, deletes the slow one, makes randomly modified copies of the faster moving ones, and repeats this process. We repeated this process on the supercomputer here at the University of Vermont for about 2 weeks. And at the end of this 2-week period, the evolutionary algorithm gave us back this particular design, which moves from left to right, although not very quickly. It does more or less what we asked the genetic algorithm to do for us. You'll notice a couple of interesting things about this Xenobot design, this evolved design. It's got passive skin tissue on the top and muscle on the bottom. You'll notice that the small patches of muscle underneath, they're not beating in synchrony with one another. They're beating at sort of random phase offsets. And we built this into the model because our biology colleagues did not know if you rearrange frog heart tissue, will it synchronize or will it not? Since there's this uncertainty, we built that uncertainty in as randomness. One of the things that I find particularly interesting about this project is you basically have a machine that's moving forward in a more or less straight line. It's moving non-randomly, but it's built from randomly acting parts. This is a very non-intuitive thing. If you ask a human engineer to try and build a non-random machine out of randomly acting parts, it's very, very difficult to do. This is part of why genetic algorithms and AI in general is quite useful. It's able to explore design space and find not just good designs, but non-intuitive designs. Designs that a human engineer or a genetic engineer or a tissue engineer might not come up with. Okay, this is part 1 of the Xenobot project. This is obviously the AI's prediction about how this design works from silico. There's a question in chat, how do we prevent the evolutionary algorithm from converging on a local optimum? That's a great question. The field of evolutionary computation has actually focused on this since the 1970s. Converging on a local optimum means the evolutionary algorithm finds a good solution, but not necessarily the optimal solution. We have no idea in the space of all possible simulated xenobots what the fastest moving xenobot is. So we don't know whether this is a local optima or a global optimum. Been a lot of advances in the field. For the experts here, we used a particular genetic algorithm known as age fitness burrito optimization, or AFPO. This particular evolutionary algorithm is very good at avoiding local optima. I don't have time in this lecture to go into the details about why, but for Anthony and others that are interested in that, please check out AFPO. It's a great algorithm for avoiding local optima. Okay, so we have this design. We now want to solve a second problem, which in the robotics community is known as the sim to real problem. How do we ensure that if we take this creature from sim and build it in real, that the real creature will still preserve the behaviors we saw in sim? Let me show you a little bit of how this process works. We took this particular design and we sent it to Doug Blackiston, the microsurgeon that works in Mike Levin's lab at Tufts. And what you're watching is you're looking down through the microscope with Doug, and you're watching him take some tissue from very, very early frog embryo. It's basically a frog egg, and he's taking the dark material. He's removing the dark material, which is sort of some of the egg casing, the shell of the egg. And what you see underneath this white material, these are white skin precursor cells. So these are a particular type of skin cells, particular type of stem cells that are destined to become skin cells. So he's gathering the light blue material to build the simulated Xenobot. Once he's collected this material, he deposits it into a shallow well or a shallow hole. And if you watch carefully, you'll notice that these several thousand skin cells are starting to compress. They're sticky, they stick to one another, and they tend to try and pull together, and what Mike would refer to as rebooting multicellularity. These cells are comfortable with, or they're used to being part of a growing frog. They have now been placed into a very different environment. And so they're falling back on this sort of default behavior of reaching out to their neighbors and pulling inward. So in some way, this early Xenobot is helping in the construction process. The way that Doug builds these particular Xenobots is to put down a layer of the skin cells that you see here. He can then scrape away some heart muscle tissue and put that on top of the skin cells, more skin, more heart, more skin, more heart, more skin, and so on. And then finally, once he's made these layers of skin and heart muscle tissue, he can reach in with a you're going to see a micro scalpel, so a very, very small knife, and with a small knife or a micro cauterization tool, which is sort of a small, very hot wire, which you can see on the right, which is burning away or removing some of this material. So in the same way that a sculptor takes a hunk of marble and removes the unnecessary parts, this is how Doug, in this case, builds these Xenobot designs. If I let this video play for another minute or two, you'll see that Doug is starting to cut away the small, he's actually got this Xenobot flipped upside down, and he's burning away some of the material to try and create these legs that you see on the left. There's a question here, can the process be automated? I'm thinking about nano 3D printers or CNC. That's a great question. There's an emerging subfield in synthetic biology known as biofabrication. So you've probably heard of 3D printers. There are 3D printers that are emerging now for printing tissue scaffolds and cellular scaffolds. So that's something I'm going to talk about towards the end of my talk here, is about automating the manufacturing side of this. Another great question. Okay. So that's a little bit about the current process of manufacturing, which is very manual. As I mentioned, these creatures are just about 1 millimeter across. So just to give you a mental picture here, the Xenobot that you see on the right is trapped in glass on the left there. So about the size of a grain of sand. Okay, so once Doug creates one of these Xenobots, he turns it right side up and puts it in the dish. And in this particular case, we were able to get a pretty good sim to real match. The physical Xenobot moves more or less like the simulated one. The behavioral match isn't perfect. It doesn't move quite like the simulated one moves. It doesn't move quite like the simulated one does, and also doesn't have exactly the same morphology. This is another important point about sim to real transfer. It's often assumed that if you want to transfer something from simulation to reality, you need to get the simulation or the model exactly right. Turns out that that's not always the case, especially when we're building biological machines. They often kind of help with their own construction or what we want them to do. Okay. So once we've built one of these Xenobots, what can we get it to do? As I mentioned, we evolved these Xenobots to move forward as quickly as possible. But just for fun, Doug took some of these Xenobots and put them back in the dish and sprinkled some very small particulate matter, some very small particles in the dish. And we got some interesting things. Like, for example, you'll notice the Xenobot in the bottom seems to be, quote unquote, interested in this very small particle. The chance that this Xenobot would bump into this particle, circle around, and come back and bump into it again, the chance of that happening is very, very, very improbable. We did not evolve these Xenobots to move particles, but this Xenobot seems interested in this particle. This is kind of strange because, again, as far as we know, we didn't build any sensors, any sensors into the Xenobot. But it's important to remember that a Xenobot is a robot made up of robots, Individual cells are their own, you can consider them a type of robot because a cell has its own sensing capabilities, its own actions. It's able to pull and push on its neighbors and produce collective action. And it can also communicate with its neighbors. So this makes biobots or Xenobots very different from traditional robots. If you think about traditional robots, we put a little bit of AI into it. We might put a neural network control policy into the CPU of the robot. But 99% of the robot itself, all the metal and plastics and ceramics, those materials themselves are not intelligent at all. They are dumb, inert material. When you build biobots, every single part of the robot is itself an intelligent machine. So in this particular case, just by accident, we got this additional functionality that we didn't evolve for. From an ethical point of view, that might be a little problematic. These things might be more capable than we want them to be. But again, it's kind of interesting from a robotics perspective. Again, since the Second World War, we've been trying to build intelligent robots, and it's been extremely difficult. Again, because those robots are very different from animals. Animals are intelligent machines made of intelligent machines made of intelligent machines. So one of the implications, I think, of Xenobots for AI and robotics in general is we want to try and build intelligent machines that are built up of intelligent machines all the way down. That's a very different way of thinking about AI, I think, than the usual way of thinking about AI. That's one particular behavior. Some of the other things we observed in a more recent paper that was published in Science Robotics this year is that we can actually get our Xenobots to remember and come back and tell us what they saw. Up until now, the Xenobots that I've shown you, they are genetically unmodified. There's a question here from Udesh. I'll just pause and answer this question. Just to clarify, do I have this about right? The Xenobot is made of different frog cells, skin and heart, built together in the arrangement specified by what the evolutionary algorithm converged to. Yes, that's correct. So we told the evolutionary algorithm it can build from frog skin and frog heart, and the evolutionary algorithm figured out how to put those pieces together. What I showed you on the previous slides, this is just one design that the evolutionary algorithm came up with. If you go and have a look at the paper, we actually extracted from the evolutionary algorithm a total of 100 designs. They all have different bodies, different shapes, and they all move in different ways, but they all do the same thing. All those 100 different Xenobots have the same function, which is to move forward as quickly as possible. This is one of the advantages of using an evolutionary algorithm, is that it doesn't design just one machine for you or one solution for you. It'll give you back a diverse set of machines that all instantiate the behavior you want in different ways. It's kind of an interesting repercussion, I think, for AI as well, which I'm happy to talk about when we finish up. Okay, so again, moving forward, again, maybe against Plishian's original statement that we shouldn't be trying to put the building blocks of intelligence into our machines, we did exactly that. So I just showed you locomotion or movement. I showed you that we have sensation for free. The Xenobot seems to be able to see that particle in some way. We're still not sure how it sees it. In this paper, we built some memory into our Xenobots. These are Xenobots that have been genetically manipulated. We introduced a fluorescent protein into these Xenobots. So when they're built, they will fluoresce or they will glow green. As these Xenobots move about in the Petri dish, if at any point they come into contact with blue light, they will switch from fluorescing green to fluorescing red, and they will stay red. So if after a couple of days you collect Xenobots back from the dish and you count the ratio, you count the number of red Xenobots compared to blue Xenobots, you get an estimate of how many of them came into contact with this particular environmental signal. So this is sort of memory or remembering in a very different way from a neural network. It is a morphological equivalent or a morphological analog of memory. Anthony says, may I see the behavior of the cell cluster as a swarm of connected heterogeneous agents? That's a great question. Let me see if I have that slide. I don't have that slide with me, but if there's time after, I'll bring up a video of some collective Xenobots that move about in the dish, multiple Xenobots. And just because of their shape, they manage to actually bump into one another and stay connected for a short period of time as they move about and then break apart again. Anthony, if I have time during the question and answer, I'll dig up that video for you. Okay, so we have now Xenobots that can move, that can see or sense things, that can remember things. Another capability that we get for free when we build biobots compared to robots is what in machine learning is known as zero-shot learning. Here's a Xenobot that's being cut almost in half. And after being cut in half, although this Xenobot has never experienced this situation before, it very rapidly heals itself from that situation. So like all organisms, Xenobots are pretty good at dealing with surprise, things that are completely outside their lifetime experience so far. This Xenobot requires no learning, no training in order to deal with damage. It does it correctly the very first time. This is a big outstanding challenge in machine learning. How do we make neural networks or embodied agents that are capable of zero-shot learning? How is it that Xenobots and organisms do it so well? Part of the answer is that what looks surprising from the point of view of the whole organism, in this case the Xenobot, is not so surprising at the cellular level. Remember that we're trying to think about these Xenobots as machines built of machines built of machines. An undamaged Xenobot, as it's moving around, the cells are constantly pulling and pushing on their neighbors. They're sensing that push and pull. Remember Wolff's law about bone development that I mentioned. The cells are constantly learning how to pull and push on their neighbors based on how their neighbors are pulling and pushing on them. When a Xenobot is cut or damaged, there is just a change in the push and pull that's acting on those cells, which causes them to change what they do and results at the whole organism level of them sealing themselves back up again. Another way to think about this is if you as an organism experience something that's surprising, it's the probability that that event is going to be surprising at the level of the whole animal at the tissue level, at the cellular level, and the subcellular level all at the same time, that event is going to be surprising to everyone in the hierarchy is extremely low. Some members of subsets of that hierarchy are going to say, I know what this is. I've sensed this situation before. I know what to do. This, I would argue, is the reason why neural networks are still so susceptible to adversarial attacks, as are robots like drones and autonomous vehicles, because they have intelligence only at one level. There is no intelligence at lower levels. So if you manage to deploy an adversarial attack that surprises the autonomous vehicle or the neural network, then it's surprised. It doesn't know what to do. Robustness and resiliency is a natural result of creating machines that are created from machines that are created from machines. I think this is, again, one of the powerful implications for thinking about AI that comes from the Xenobot research. Okay, so I want to end by just introducing one last project which has nothing to do with Xenobots to illustrate this idea of how Xenobots can get us to think differently about how AI and robotics. As I mentioned, robots are not machines built of machines built of machines. So towards the this year, we asked, well, let's try and make a robot, a relatively traditional robot that is also is a machine made of machines made of machines. And the way we approach this is to create fractal robots. What I'm going to show you in a moment is a traditional, is a robot that is built up again of cubes. And we're going to use an evolutionary algorithm to search over the space of all possible fractal robots. What do I mean by a fractal robot? Well, the evolutionary algorithm encodes, in this case, not a tissue rearrangement. It encodes instructions saying, place a cube here, place a cube here, place a cube here, place a cube here, and so on. So what you're looking at here is sort of actually the DNA in an evolutionary algorithm, a set of 18 instructions that in this case says, put these blocks in this place to build up a robot that you see in panel 18. We can turn this into a fractal robot by taking those 18 build instructions and repeating them with the robot we got at step 18. So I'll just go back and forth between these so you can sort of see how this works. This is a robot that is structurally self-similar. If you zoom in at any part of the robot, it has more or less the same shape. Given the fact that this robot is structurally self-similar, it looks the same at different levels, at different scales, is it also behaviorally self-similar? The answer is, in some cases, yes. So what you see on the left, this is the base robot that was encoded by the evolutionary algorithm. And you're going to notice that it's going to trace a little colored line. So it's sort of, the behavior is represented by the line, showing how this thing moves. If you take that little base robot and fractally compose it, you get the robot on the right. And that robot at a larger scale moves more or less like the smaller robot does. So this is a robot that is structurally self-similar, looks the same at different scales, and is also functionally self-similar. It does the same thing at different scales. Just for fun, we took this medium robot and again composed it to produce this higher level structure. So this is a robot made of robots made of robots. And it took a long time to simulate this single robot, but it also is somewhat behaviorally self-similar. It moves more or less in the same way that the medium and the small robot move. Okay, that was the last thing I wanted to present, just to give you an idea of how Xenobots might inform our thinking about AI and robotics in general. I'll stop there and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks very much.